Hello and welcome to the second webinar in our series of a year of cultural reflection. So today we're going to talk about cultural humility, a school counselor's approach. Our aim is to make this practical. It's a brief webinar in a series of many opportunities to be on a journey, on a road to continue to improve our practice. So, who are we? I'm Joe Morcom from Totino Grace High School. I'm joined by my outstanding colleagues, Becky Mendoza and Derek Francis, and we'll walk through some pieces for you to start the conversation. Really, the goals for this webinar is to learn the concept of what is cultural humility. I'm sure some pieces will be familiar to you, but we want to really dig into how we can have intention around this. Also to understand that there's many concepts around cultural awareness and development, and so to help define what is the difference between cultural humility and cultural competence. Finally, we love action items. What can you do with this? What are action steps that you can take in your office with your students today? So really simple things that we'll leave you with before the end of today's webinar. So let's start with a simple definition. What is cultural humility? The short answer is, it really is. It's a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, being aware of not only your own cultural background, upbringings, beliefs, underpinnings, but the world around you, and being committed to that constant set of values and habits to better understand, to sometimes, as my colleague Derek might mention, put yourself in the one down position. How can you see different points of view? And then working with people to just, again, humble yourself in knowing, how are you different and how are we the same and how can we relate, and tell me more about that. A lot of these open-ended reflective questions are at the heart of this cultural humility as we all continue to learn and journey together. So within cultural humility, we see three dimensions. One, absolutely, a lifelong learning journey and the critical self-reflection. The honest truth is this webinar will not cure insensitivity or any biases a person might have. It's designed to open you up just a little bit more and to engage in some more dialogue with your teachers, colleagues, and students. Two, it's a community effort. We want you to build partnerships. We want you to be open and realize that we are better together. So the more that you can reach out and start to forge new relationships, maybe in places where there's tension or discomfort in your community, you might be called to be that change maker of something that's been a decade-long discomfort in your school or just in the neighboring businesses that you work and play at. Three, recognizing and challenging power imbalances. It's so important that if we find ourselves stuck in the same rut, just imagine the experience of students that feel stuck, that feel powerless. And so we are helping model how can you challenge ideas and beliefs and the current structure of things in a school to help students do that in a respectful way. That's really something important in our world today. And so you can be a model of that. And again, it's very okay if that model is imperfect. We're working on this together. And now I'm going to hand it over to Derek so he can help us understand the difference between cultural competence versus cultural humility.
Yep, so it's important to recognize that there's a difference between the cultural competence and cultural humility. Cultural competence, and a lot of us as educators will fall into that mold of thinking of, you know what, I went to the session, I listened to this actual webinar on cultural humility and think, check the box, I'm good. And it's a thinking of we've arrived, that I have this certificate, that I went to this training, that I did this missions trip. So being mindful, that's all cultural competency, and that's not an appropriate approach necessarily, because you'll never have mastery over someone else's culture or life experience. So the issue is not competency. We have a lot of competent counselors out there. It's around humility. Cultural humility asks you to think about, how is my life experience, what are some things in my life experience that shaped me of how I am? That's a lifelong process for me to learn and connect and get to know about other people. It's a journey. I'll never arrive, but I'm always going to continue to try to learn. To further define humility, uh, that can be just understand to get low, be down to earth, be humble. Take the You'll hear more about just taking the one down approach, being on the same level as. When someone is humble, that person is recognizing that others' viewpoints, values, behaviors, traditions, those must be valid, just as valid as my own. Uh, and so part of cultural humility is the restraint from feeling like you're all knowing, like you know everything, that you are always in that driver's seat. It's more of recognizing I have limitations. I have some things that I don't fully know and that I need to grow in. And that's part of doing the critical self-reflection work, knowing that this is an ongoing process, cultural humility, and understanding that if you're going to be a critical learner, a critical person, you do self-reflection and you want to turn those things into actions. Uh, and so be mindful of what shortcomings you have. What gaps do you have in your learning? Uh, and be understanding of, you know what, it doesn't make you a bad person because you have these gaps. You just haven't had that exposure in your life to certain situations or environments. And this is an opportunity for you to grow and build relationships. So some questions to ask yourself might be, how does my cultural identity and privilege limit my ability to see and understand lack of privilege and marginalization? What are some of my gut reactions when students come in that are from different backgrounds? How am I creating a space that's welcoming to students to explore their cultural identity? And then also, how am I open to the feedback from students about my level of cultural competency? Those are things to ask yourself as you go into reflection. And we got Becky gonna come through and share about some things to be mindful of around power.
So, one of the elements that we'll see a lot when we talk about humility and cultural humility, especially, is this idea of what power and how power plays into relationships and partnerships. I mean, as school counselors, we work with teachers and families and students in so many different capacities that we have to recognize what that power looks like. And we have to be able to challenge power imbalances in order to have those respectful partnerships. So, thinking about things like maybe what your power as a teacher or staff member has over students or other staff members. Maybe you can think of a time when you were working with an administrator who is intensely disciplining a student and you were trying to figure out how to challenge that, especially if this is a student of color, and how that plays into your school's experience as a whole. Maybe are you aware of your personal biases and assumptions about people who have power? It could even be something that you as a school staff or school counselor have a powered position over your student, and how do they see you? But the root of effective educator practice is in acknowledging and challenging the power imbalances that are inherent in those different teacher, student, and family dynamics. So how do you work through that? Well, building relationships is a huge piece of working through that power dynamic, but also in experiencing and growing in your own cultural humility. So those relationships, they're based on trust and respect. And you're developing these mutual beneficial goals, but remember, it's not the student's job to address that power imbalance. Like, that's your job in building that relationship. They will respect you when you respect them. And so that consistency and follow-up is authentic for that presence. It's authentic, and kids can sense that authenticity from a mile away. So how can you build relationships with kids? Many of you know these skills about getting to know them, knowing things about their family. One question that Joe talked about earlier before we recorded this was, tell me about a favorite food from your home country or from your culture. Those things that show students you're genuinely interested in who they are as people. But sometimes, and maybe sometimes, there will be mistakes that happen. And I am not perfect. I have had my foot stuck in my mouth so many times. And that, first off, that's 100% okay. there is no expectation to be perfect because that's where you grow. And that discomfort you experience is where you can grow the most. So some really common things that happen as far as errors go: microaggressions. That's a very common one. You might not even realize that you're doing or experiencing any microaggressions. Maybe you're generalizing a group of people based on this new knowledge. Like, oh, I watched this TED Talk and now I know everything about immigrants that are new to the country. You probably don't. But then when you start to get uncomfortable, you start to default to this privilege and power of, well, I have a master's degree, so therefore I know this. I'm uncomfortable, so that means I'm going to like put on this front that I know everything. That, or sometimes it leads to avoidance, where like, you know what, I made a mistake. I don't want to have that happen again. I'm uncomfortable, so I'm going to avoid it and just never engage in that work ever again. And none of those things really allow you to grow and to fix those errors. So the next step then, how does this sound? So Derek, give us some insights onto what cultural humility sounds like in our counseling practice.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. And I think what cultural humility sounds like is a chance for you to start incorporating some of these practices into your conversations with students, staff, and so you have to be mindful of your own self, again, to get to this point. So sharing that, you know what, one thing you say is, you know what, I've not experienced what you're sharing with me before. Tell me more about what that feels like. That's taking that approach to say, you know what, I've had to do that with students where I'm like, you know what, I don't know what it feels like to live in this part of town. I haven't lived here. I don't know what it feels like to experience the microaggression of being a Somali American. And I want to learn. I say that too because people of color, like I'm talking to my people of color right now, you have to make sure that you're doing this work. Just because I'm a person of color doesn't mean I've arrived, that I know how to do this, because that's not the case. Also, you have to be honest and say, you know, I haven't experienced that environment, like I just said. Talk about the messaging maybe you received growing up that makes it hard for you to understand what's going on, and being vulnerable is saying, you know what, I'm still working on this. I want to get better at this. That shows another level of humility. And then also putting it out there to do some self-reflection and say, you know what, at any point during our lesson or during the session or during the small group, if I'm not understanding your cultural background, or if I say something, hey, please correct me. I want to get better at this. So those are some approaches you can take.
Thanks for that, Derek. And I can definitely resonate some moments because students, they want to call you on stuff. They want to keep you honest, and it could be a funny or an awkward moment. But the way you approach that allows safety into the space to be imperfect. So when these errors happen, as best as you can, just say, oh, I'm sorry. You know, acknowledge it first. Like, oh, I didn't even realize. And typically that's not easy to do, but doing this work, it does get easier over time. But then just ask for forgiveness. Humble yourself to admit you don't know everything. But the challenge is try to pause. Have that moment to acknowledge it. Have that forgiveness, but try not to get defensive. You know, sometimes a person has an instinct to say, well, I have friends who are white or black, or I work in a school that is 100% free and reduced, so we can talk about it. We don't need the context. We need growth. And so challenge yourself. I happen to work at a private Catholic school, which often jokes about guilt, that Catholic guilt. But the challenge is guilt can be a healthy, productive, motivating thing to avoid being late to school, to avoid harming others unintentionally. I want us to be really cautious to avoid the shame of we're stupid, we're invaluable, we're not good enough because we make these mistakes. And then continue to consult, talk to a trusted colleague or other people who maybe can continue that dialogue in your office.
All right, so here's a couple of next steps and best practices. Continue learning. Try to find time to connect with people from different cultural backgrounds and perspectives. Continue to find opportunities. Again, this is just one presentation. Find others. Make sure you're taking the back seat and offering yourself grace if you have errors in doing this work. Here's our crew. This is us. If you have questions, email us. We are a part of MSCA. If you're also tasked with planning professional developments for your school or for your counseling department or your district or county, and you're looking for something counselor specific around equity, feel free to reach out. And here's a resource around culture of humility. Thanks a ton.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.